Hello. I'm going to try to address Mr. Wittgenstein today. Wittgenstein is a pretty colorful character, very famous philosopher from the 20th century. Wittgenstein is very deceptive because he's way easier to read than people like Kant. And you might think, wow, this is pretty simple. Yeah, he is. He is easier to read, but he's much more difficult to understand. That's the problem with Wittgenstein. Um, one reason for that I'll start with is that you have to read Wittgenstein as responding to earlier philosophers or other philosophers. In particular, Russell and Frege, who I mentioned last time when I was talking about Russell, Frege too. And by the way, himself, his earlier work, the Tractatus, was much more in line with the ideas of Russell and Frege than his later work, which is the Philosophical Investigations, which is what you're reading, or you should be reading for this assignment. So you always get, who is he talking to? It's kind of, when he's writing these things, who is he talking to? He's talking to Russell, he's talking to Frege, he's talking to himself earlier, he's talking to other philosophers sometimes as well, other colleagues and other earlier philosophers. All right, so just to make that point, the very first thing he says in the Investigations is he quotes Saint Augustine, about the idea that a meaning of a word is what it is correlated to. Now he picked Augustine, but he could vary. It's kind of a roundabout, way of picking Russell, I think, and Frege, who both said that meaning is reference. At least that's one of the two key elements of meaning, and probably the most important element of meaning is that a word refers to an object. And so when he quotes Augustine, he's kind of, he's just pointing to those guys more than he is Augustine. Meaning is reference. For a word to have meaning, it has to have reference. And he immediately begins to criticize this. And this is, you'll see this happen over and over again in his writings. He quotes somebody and then he responds to it. So note that when you're reading his text, that there's a quote, and then there's like, and this is what I have to say about it. All right, so what does he have to say about this in particular? He says, this does not respect the different types of words. And he gives the example of 5 red apples, which he says you take a note to a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper, you hand the shopkeeper the note that says 5 red apples. And how does the shopkeeper respond to the note? Well, look, all this is very much exaggerated, by the way, just to make a point. So one thing though is apples is an object, so the shopkeeper does have to find the apples. But he has to do a very different thing when he's trying to figure out what red means. And Wittgenstein imagines that he pulls out a color palette and looks for the word red and compares the red to the apples and finds the red ones. Like I said, they're kind of exaggerated to make a point. And then he has to deal with the word 5, and then 5 he has to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And his point is, these are very different things. Words do different things. It's not all about reference, is kind of the point, right? That's kind of his first observation. It's not all about reference. Apples, that was reference. Red is not a reference. That's a different activity. So is counting. How does he know how to do this? He just acts. This is very fundamental to Wittgenstein's point of view, that explanations come to an end. That is, that at the very basis of all of it, it's just that the guy knows how to use words. He's learned how to use color words and how to use, how to count and how to find objects. He's learned these things. He's learned how to use these words. Meaning is use. This is a key. There's a couple of key concepts in Wittgenstein. Meaning is use is one of them. Um, he doesn't say that unequivocally, by the way. Actually, what he says is, in most but not all cases, the meaning of the word is the use you give it. Um, but this notion that the meaning of a word is how you use it, not, like, for instance, not necessarily its reference. So he's got to get different concept of language. Just a quick reminder from the last discussion, the linguistic turn and the fact that thought is in language, which Wittgenstein is obviously following in that line of thinking, as, by the way, everybody is. I mean, this is not, pretty much almost every philosopher around today agrees with that idea that thought is in language. And if that's true, Wittgenstein thinks we need to really get to the bottom of what language is and how it works. Anyway, so one way of doing this is by this notion of language games, which the other video I put up, that was the center of that discussion. Actually, that guy talked about a lot of other things too, but that was supposed to be the main idea of that. And language games are just one kind of use of language. In this case, he describes it as a more primitive form of language. Sometimes he talks about language games as being the way that children learn words. So it doesn't have to be primitive forms necessarily. It's just the different ways that we use language. And so he describes a language like Augustine's, where there's a tribe of builders that only have 4 words: block, pillar, slab, and beam. And his comment here again is, this is like saying that you move objects around a board according to certain rules describes games, which, you know, chess, checkers, there are games that you move objects around a board, but it's certainly not all games. And that is kind of the point he's making here. Language, like games, has a lot of different varieties. And he picks the word games in particular because it's really hard to pin down what makes a game a game. That's sort of why he wanted to, sorry, I have an allergy attacks today. That's sort of why he wanted to choose the idea of games, because what makes a game a game? Does it have to be competitive? No. Do you even need more than one person? You can play solitaire. I mean, if you really try to drill down on what makes a game, it doesn't have to be fun. No. A lot of people play war games. Doesn't sound that fun to me. But anyways, the idea is we call all these things games, but they don't have really anything in particular in common. And he wants to say the same thing about language. We call all these things language, but there isn't really any particular thing that ties all of our different uses of language together. There's not one particular thing that makes all language language. This is something worth noting. He says the ostensive teaching in the builder's example happens within an activity. One thing that is true about language, according to Wittgenstein, is language occurs in an activity. We use it in the context of doing things. It doesn't really stand alone like a lot of philosophers think it does. And he also mentions that invoking the idea of a slab is not the point. So, you know, this goes to that whole thing about ideas and how thought is mental versus, imagine 2 builders. Okay, so one builder, the guy calls out pillar, and the other builder hears the word pillar, and he imagines a pillar in his head, and he looks around to match that picture in his head to the things he's looking at, and he sees a pillar that matches up with it, and he goes and grabs that and brings it. Okay, good. Okay, a second builder. hears the word pillar, and he's just had a fight with his wife. He's having a bad day. He's not even, so he just hears the word, and he's doing his job, so he just goes and grabs a pillar, but he doesn't imagine any pillar in his head. He just goes and gets it. Did the second guy not understand? Of course he understood. The guy called out pillar, he brought a pillar. In other words, this has to do this is more of a Fregean point, that is following Frege, that the idea in your head doesn't matter. If you react to the words in the appropriate way, in the context, in the activity, you understood. He says the context makes the words mean what they do, and without it could mean anything or nothing at all. All right, so yeah, context is central to understanding the meaning of a word. I mean, if you just say something at random, walk up to somebody in the street and say, ham sandwich. Everybody like, what in the hell are you talking about, you crazy bastard? Get away from me. Ham sandwich? What do you mean? You want a ham sandwich? What do you want? What is this? If you're at a lunch line and you're asking for lunch and you say ham sandwich and the guy hands you a ham sandwich, well, that works. It means something there. But it's the context. It's the context that makes it mean something. And as he says, without the context, it could mean anything. That's kind of deceptive, by the way, because you think ham sandwich, well, I know what those words mean, but that only means that the point of that is that you know how to use those words in the appropriate time and place. It doesn't mean they just mean anything, anytime, anywhere. Have you ever written yourself a note and you go back and look at it? You have a great idea. This happens to me. I don't know about you. And you go back and look at it and you're like, what in the hell was I talking about? Because I lost the context. I don't even remember in what context I was thinking about that. And so it lost all of its meaning. Context is critical. Being part of an activity is critical. Those are not the same things, but similar. It has to be part of a larger either thought process or something that you're actually doing. Only in those places do words mean anything. Without them, could mean anything or nothing at all. All right, so he imagines adding some more words to his example about the builders. So let's add color and numbers and there and this to the builder's example. Remember, it was only block, pillar, slab, and beam before. Now, the key idea here, he doesn't really go into a whole bunch of discussion about this, but he wants to point out here is, how do these concepts get taught? How would you teach children to use colors and numbers and there and this? And the main point is you can't just point. You can't just, hey, red, blue, there, this. Think about it. When you point at something, it seems like you're pointing at a slab or a beam or a plate or a cup or whatever you're pointing at. I mean, the first thing that people think when you point is it's the object. But how would you distinguish pointing at the object from pointing at the color of the thing? Or even counting. You could be saying 1, 2, or there, or this. How would you make the distinction between those things? You can't just do it by pointing. And so he says the uses of these different types of words are different, and you can't explain what each one does in the same way. All right. By the way, this is not supposed to be some kind of mysterious, crazy mystery about how you teach children how to learn these words, because we all teach children how to learn these words. And just, watch how children learn the words. And Wittgenstein pays a lot more attention to children learning than many other philosophers do. He was a teacher, by the way, but he, how do children learn these kinds of words? And watch Sesame Street. You learn how. That's one way. Okay, moving on. So he says, imagine a toolbox or the train or the cab of a train, and the idea here is, and he's comparing this to words. So a toolbox, everything in the box is a tool. Every word is a word, but doesn't mean every tool does the same thing. A screwdriver does a whole different thing from a hammer, and that's a whole different thing from a saw. Just because they're all tools doesn't mean they do the same thing. Words the same way. Just because words are all words, that doesn't mean they all do the same thing. The cab of a train, he's talking about all the controls and stuff. And, these controls do this and those controls do that, but one stops the train, one accelerates. They all look the same, which some people like that comparison or that analogy better because words kind of look the same, but they all do different things. Same idea here. And so he says to say that every word signifies something is to say nothing at all until you specify this distinction you are making. You cannot assimilate all language under one description. All right. Trying to give this blanket definition, I guess you would say, of all words. Oh, they all signify something. That doesn't really tell you anything until you start to talk about the different ways that words signify, the different things that they do. Okay. Remember, all of this is a criticism of Frege and Russell and trying to assimilate all language under the meaning of a word is its reference, for instance. And Wittgenstein is saying, no, that's not how a language works. You got to look more carefully at how this is supposed to happen. All right, so I'm going to read this passage 6. It's on, well, sorry. Don't note page 612. That's my text. It's actually, the passage is passage 23, where he says, how many kinds of sentence are there? Say assertion, question, and command. There are countless kinds, countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences. And this multiplicity is not something fixed, given once for all, but new types of language, new language games, as we may say, come into existence and others become obsolete and forgotten. Here the term language game is meant to bring into prominence the fact that the speaking of a language is a part of an activity or a form of life. Form of life is another key concept. So he says, review the multiplicity of language games in the following examples and in others. And he has this big list I'll read quickly. Giving orders and obeying them, describing the appearance of an object or giving its measurements, constructing an object from a description, a drawing, reporting an event, speculating about an event, forming and testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story and reading it, play acting, singing catches, guessing riddles, making a joke and telling it, solving a problem in practical arithmetic, translating from one language into another, asking, thinking, cursing, greeting, praying. Boy, I bet the computer program that tries to write this is going to have a fun with that one. All right. Anyway, he says, it's interesting to compare the multiplicity of tools in language and of the ways that they are used, the multiplicity of kinds of words and sentence, with what logicians have had to say about the structure of language, including the author of the Tractatus, which, like I mentioned earlier, that's him earlier. So he's criticizing his own earlier idea of how language is supposed to work. All right, note forms of life. So that's kind of a more broad idea of the same thing as language takes place in the course of an activity. So if you put that on a grander scale, it's all of our activities and how we exist in the world as human animals, as creatures that survive in the world. How do we, that he thinks of as form of life. This, by the way, does account for like cultural differences. I always like to know, like just note things like Eskimos have 20 words for snow. Why? Well, because they need to make those distinctions where they live, you know. We could get away with one or none even probably here in California. Well, depends on where you live. But they need 20 words for snow, wet snow, dry snow, this, you know. But that's because of their form of life. That's where they live and how you know, how their social interactions provide for themselves in their environment. All that together, form of life, not only social, but also the environmental situation that they exist in, where you live, how you live. Okay, and then he says, this is another passage that comes shortly thereafter. Commanding, questioning, recounting, chatting are as much a part of our natural history as walking, eating, drinking, and playing. Wittgenstein doesn't think of thought as some kind of crazy, unique human ability that we're tapping into godlike powers, which a lot of philosophers thought that way. I mean, Aristotle, Descartes, probably most of them. For Wittgenstein, it's just being able to speak is part of how we get around in the world, part of our form of life. It's like eating and drinking and playing. It's just part of our natural history. It's not some otherworldly kind of thing. It's part of the way that we as animals exist in the world. All right, as if naming was all there is to it. I think I might skip that passage. That's number 27. I'd read 23 earlier. If you'd like to look at that, that's 27. All right, he says, Augustine describes language like a foreigner coming into a new country. That is, you already know a language, just not this one. You can already think in language. And that goes back to the very first passage in the book where he quotes Augustine. Yeah, look, and this again, a lot of philosophers again, do describe language in this kind of way. Locke would be a perfect example, where it's just like you're mapping language onto the thoughts that you already had. And Wittgenstein is like, no, you didn't even have any thoughts until you learned language. Language is how you are able to create thoughts. It's not like you're a foreigner where you know a language already and then you come and try to correlate the words in the new language to the ones you already. You didn't have any words before you learn language. You learn to think as a child. You learn to think in words, and that is it's not like you had thoughts in language and before that you get that from learning how to speak. Okay, how do people learn to speak of sensations? All right, I'm going to take a pause. This is another topic, and perhaps put this on a separate video. This is the private language argument, and it has to do with rules in private language. I'll talk about that shortly.